April 1945. Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the converted military compound where rows of barracks stood in perfect formation, their wooden sides bleached by months of southern heat that turned the paint to a pale ghost of its original olive drab. The red clay soil between buildings had been packed hard by thousands of footsteps, and heat shimmered off the metal roofs in visible waves that distorted the air. Inside kitchen number 3, Corporal James Washington wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, careful not to contaminate his hands as he prepared the evening meal for 247 prisoners who had arrived just weeks before. The familiar routine of frying chicken filled the air with the aroma of his grandmother's recipe, a scent that carried him instantly back to Birmingham, back to Sunday afternoons, when the whole neighborhood seemed to gather in her small kitchen that somehow accommodated everyone who needed feeding. He expected nothing unusual from this evening, just another service, just another meal in the endless rotation of military duty that had defined his life for the past 3 years. The rhythmic sizzle of chicken in hot oil provided a soundtrack to his work, a sound as familiar to him as his own breathing, as comforting in its predictability as anything could be in the uncertain final months of a global conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What James could not have anticipated was how a simple meal would shatter everything he believed about the enemy, about prejudice, and about the unexpected connections that could form across the deepest divides of war. Connections that would reshape not only his own understanding, but would ripple forward through decades, touching lives in ways no one standing in that kitchen could have possibly imagined. James Washington had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business and where your reputation was built through years of consistent character rather than momentary actions. The smell of fried chicken meant Sunday gatherings after church at Mount Zion Baptist, family reunions that brought relatives from as far away as Atlanta and Memphis, and his grandmother's kitchen that seemed to hold the entire neighborhood on weekend afternoons, her small house somehow expanding to accommodate anyone who needed a meal or a listening ear or simply a place to feel welcome. His grandmother, Esther Washington, had been born in 1886, the daughter of people who had been enslaved, and she carried within her the living memory of that transition from bondage to freedom. She had taught James that dignity was something you claimed through how you carried yourself, through the care you took in your work, through treating others with respect, even when you received none in return. She had taught him to cook the way her mother had taught her, with patience and attention, and the understanding that food was never just food, but was communication, care, and culture, all woven together in ways that transcended mere sustenance. When he enlisted in 1942 at the age of 21, James carried those memories with him like a shield against the segregation he found even in uniform. The army had been officially desegregated in theory, but in practice, black soldiers still faced separate facilities, inferior equipment, and assignment to roles that kept them away from combat and glory. The Quartermaster Corps, cooking detail, which suited him fine despite the implicit message that black men were considered better suited for serving food than carrying rifles. He knew his way around a kitchen better than most men knew their rifles, and he took pride in that knowledge, in the skills that had been passed down through generations. At 24 years old, having served 3 years in uniform, he had seen enough of military life to understand its contradictions, serving a country that did not always serve him back, fighting for freedoms abroad that were denied to people who looked like him at home. But he did his duty with quiet dignity, maintained his standards of excellence, and made the best meals he could with whatever supplies came his way, because that was what his grandmother had taught him to do, and because maintaining that standard was its own form of resistance against those who would reduce him to something less than fully human. Fort Oglethorpe had been transformed into a prisoner of war camp in 1943, one of dozens scattered across the American heartland, where captured enemy personnel waited out the war's conclusion, housed in facilities that ranged from converted fairgrounds to purpose-built compounds. The facility had previously served as a training center where young American men learned the basics of military discipline before being shipped overseas, and before that, during the First World War, it had also housed prisoners, creating a strange continuity across generations of conflict. The grounds covered several hundred acres of northwest Georgia landscape, with the distinctive red clay soil that characterized the region, pine trees lining the perimeter roads, and distant views of Lookout Mountain rising against the horizon. Now it held a unique population that had arrived in March of 1945, evacuated from units that had been stationed in occupied territories across Europe as the German forces collapsed under the combined pressure of Allied advances from both east and west. These were not combat soldiers, but auxiliary personnel, women between the ages of 18 and 45, who had served in communications, administration, medical support, and logistics for the German military forces during the conflict, performing roles that freed men for combat duties. Their arrival had caused considerable discussion among the camp staff, as few American installations had experience managing female prisoners from overseas, and the logistics of housing, security, and basic dignity in such circumstances required adaptation of standard protocols. The women had arrived thin, exhausted, and silent, their faces showing the strain of months of retreat and uncertainty. They had been transported across the Atlantic in converted cargo vessels, a journey of 17 days through rough spring seas that seemed to stretch endlessly. With most of the women crowded into holds that had been minimally adapted for human cargo, the smell of diesel fuel and seasickness permeating everything. Many had been sick for the entire voyage, unable to keep down the minimal rations provided, their bodies weakened by months of insufficient food even before the crossing began. They had expected harsh treatment upon arrival in America. Perhaps even the kind of brutality that propaganda had promised awaited anyone who fell into enemy hands, stories of torture and execution that had been drilled into them during their service. Instead, they found themselves in a compound that, while austere and clearly a place of imprisonment, offered clean barracks with real beds and blankets, medical care from American doctors who treated their ailments without cruelty, and 3 meals daily that, while plain and institutional, provided more calories than many of them had seen in months. The confusion this caused was visible in their faces during those first weeks, a cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality that left many of them withdrawn and suspicious, unable to reconcile what they had been taught to expect with what they were actually experiencing, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the promised cruelty to reveal itself beneath the surface courtesy. James had observed them from a distance during his duties, catching glimpses as he moved between the kitchen and the supply depot, as he delivered special dietary requests to the camp infirmary, as he crossed the compound on various errands that took him near their sections. He worked in one of 3 kitchens that served different sections of the camp, with his facility specifically designated to prepare meals for the barracks housing female prisoners, a responsibility that came with particular protocols about maintaining appropriate boundaries and security measures. He rarely saw them up close, as the food was delivered through a serving line managed by other personnel, with guards maintaining the separation between kitchen staff and prisoners, but he caught glimpses during his trips to the supply depot, where requisition forms had to be filed and approved, and he noticed their guarded expressions, the way they moved in tight groups, even in the open spaces between buildings, unwilling to separate or trust their surroundings despite the apparent safety of the compound. He noticed how they walked close together, shoulders nearly touching, as if proximity to each other was the only security they could trust. He noticed how their eyes tracked every movement around them, cataloguing threats, calculating distances to cover. He noticed the way younger women stayed near older ones, seeking the comfort of maternal presence in a foreign land where nothing felt safe or familiar. He understood that wariness on a level that required no translation. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of black soldiers when they traveled through certain towns in the South, that constant calculation of threat and safety that became so automatic you barely noticed you were doing it anymore. It was the same vigilance his grandmother had taught him to maintain, the awareness of where you were, who was around you, where the exits were located, who might be friendly and who might pose danger. It was the exhausting mental work of navigating a world that might turn hostile at any moment, where your survival depended on reading subtle signs and making quick assessments. He recognized it because he lived it, because despite wearing an American uniform and serving his country, he still had to be careful about which towns he entered on leave, which establishments would serve him, which interactions might turn dangerous if he forgot his place in the social hierarchy. The irony of recognizing this shared experience in enemy prisoners was not lost on him, and it created a strange kinship that he did not fully understand but could not deny. On this particular April evening, with dogwood trees blooming white across the compound and the last winter chill finally giving way to genuine spring warmth, James had been assigned to prepare what the mess sergeant called a morale meal, something beyond the usual rotation of stews thickened with too much flour, potatoes prepared in every conceivable way to stretch the ration budget, and canned vegetables that had lost most of their color and all of their texture in the industrial preservation process. The supply depot had received a shipment of fresh chicken, 300 pounds of it packed in ice and delivered on the morning transport from Atlanta, along with flour in clean white sacks that still smelled faintly of the mill, buttermilk in large glass bottles that sweated condensation in the Georgia heat, and shortening in 5-pound tins that bore labels promising pure vegetable oil. The sergeant had looked at James with an expression that combined command and trust and said, "You know how to make this work better than anyone else in this kitchen, so make it special. Make it something they will remember." The implication was clear, that this meal was meant to serve some purpose beyond mere nutrition, perhaps as part of some larger policy decision about how to treat prisoners as the conflict drew to its inevitable conclusion, perhaps simply as a recognition that even people held in custody deserved occasional moments of something better than mere subsistence. James had nodded his understanding, already planning the meal in his head before the sergeant finished speaking, his mind moving through the steps his grandmother had taught him, the process so deeply ingrained that it felt less like cooking and more like a form of meditation. He would fry the chicken the way his grandmother had taught him, with a buttermilk soak that tenderized the meat and added a subtle tang, a seasoned flour dredge that created that perfect crunchy exterior. Hand careful attention to the oil temperature, because too hot and the outside burned before the inside cooked, too cool and the meat absorbed grease and became soggy and heavy. It was the kind of cooking that required patience and timing, each piece needing individual care to achieve that perfect golden crust that shattered when you bit into it, revealing tender meat that stayed juicy because the coating had sealed in all the natural moisture. It was cooking that could not be rushed, that demanded your full attention and respect for the ingredients and the process. He started his preparation at 1400 hours, 2 full hours before the meal would need to be served, because rushing this kind of cooking was an insult to both the food and the people who would eat it. First came the task of breaking down the chickens, which had arrived whole and needed to be cut into serving pieces. James worked with practiced efficiency, his knife finding joints and separating pieces with minimal waste, sorting them by size so they would cook evenly. The breasts, being the largest, went into one pile, the thighs and drumsticks into another, the wings, smaller and quicker to cook, into a third. Even in this preliminary work, his grandmother's training showed the economy of motion, the respect for the ingredients, the understanding that every step in the process mattered. He prepared his buttermilk bath in a large stainless steel mixing bowl, one of dozens that hung from hooks above the preparation counter, adding salt to enhance the flavor penetration, and a touch of black pepper for subtle heat that would complement rather than dominate the other seasonings. Then he submerged the chicken pieces, making sure each was fully coated, pressing them down into the liquid until the buttermilk covered everything. This soaking was crucial, not just for tenderness, but for allowing the flavors to begin their work, beginning the transformation from raw ingredients into the finished dish. While the chicken rested in its bath, he turned his attention to the flour coating, the mixture that would create that signature crust. He mixed his flour in a large, shallow pan, one that would allow him to dredge pieces efficiently without making a mess. To the flour, he added his own blend of seasonings that he kept in a small tin in his locker, a combination that his grandmother had developed over decades of cooking and that he had modified slightly based on his own experimentation and the ingredients available in army kitchens: paprika for color and a gentle sweetness, garlic powder for depth, onion powder for savory complexity, dried thyme and oregano for herbal notes, a generous amount of black pepper for heat, salt in a ratio that seemed excessive to anyone watching, but that would season the chicken perfectly once the cooking process concentrated and intensified all the flavors. He mixed it all together with his hands, feeling the texture, making sure everything was evenly distributed, adding more of this or that until it felt right in a way that had nothing to do with measurements and everything to do with experience and intuition. His grandmother had made him promise to never write down the recipe, to keep it in his head and his hands, passed down through demonstration rather than documentation, because she believed that recipes committed to paper lost something essential, became rigid and lifeless where they should be fluid and responsive to conditions and ingredients. He had kept that promise through 3 years of military service, through countless meals prepared for hundreds of people, maintaining the tradition even as everything else in his life had been documented, measured, and reduced to forms and protocols. The other cooks in the kitchen watched him work with a mixture of curiosity and respect that had developed over months of shared duty. Most of them were white soldiers from various parts of the country, farm boys from Iowa and Nebraska who had grown up with meat and potatoes simplicity, city kids from Philadelphia and Boston who barely knew how to operate a can opener when they first arrived, sons of immigrants who brought their own food traditions but had never worked in a professional kitchen environment. When James had first been assigned to Fort Oglethorpe, some had been initially skeptical of working alongside a black cook, their prejudices showing in small ways, in doubts about whether he knew what he was doing, in reluctance to follow his instructions, in that particular tone of voice that tried to establish superiority through condescension. But James had earned their respect through the consistent quality of his meals, through his willingness to teach anyone who wanted to learn, through the way he maintained his standards even under the difficult conditions and constant supply shortages that characterized military cooking. He never responded to disrespect with anger, only with excellence, proving himself through results rather than arguments, and gradually even the most skeptical had come to recognize his skill and value. Private Miller, a kid from a small town near Des Moines who barely knew how to boil water when he arrived at Fort Oglethorpe 7 months earlier, had become something of an apprentice, watching James's techniques with the intensity of a student learning sacred texts, asking questions that showed genuine curiosity rather than mere time-filling conversation. Miller had grown up on a farm where food was fuel rather than art, where meals were functional affairs designed to support hard physical labor, and he had never considered that cooking could be creative or meaningful until he watched James work. Now he spent every shift trying to absorb the lessons James offered, not just about techniques, but about the philosophy behind them. The understanding that cooking for others was a form of care and respect. That how you prepared food communicated your values as clearly as words ever could. On this evening, Miller stood at the adjacent counter, monitoring the potatoes James had assigned him, peeling and quartering them for mashing, but his attention kept drifting to the chicken preparation, stealing glances at the process, mentally cataloging each step for future reference. Sergeant Patterson, the head of Kitchen Number 3, a career Army man from Tennessee who had been cooking for soldiers since before most of the current kitchen staff were born, had initially been the most skeptical of having a black cook in his kitchen, but he had become one of James's strongest advocates after tasting his biscuits in the first week of his assignment. Patterson ran the kitchen with military efficiency, but had the wisdom to recognize talent when he saw it, and to let skilled people operate with appropriate freedom. He handled the administrative side of kitchen operations, the requisition forms and duty rosters and inspections, while trusting James and the other skilled cooks to handle the actual food preparation. It was an arrangement that worked well for everyone, maintaining the military hierarchy while acknowledging the practical realities of who actually knew how to cook. "How do you know when the oil is ready?" Miller asked, leaning closer to watch James test the temperature of the shortening that shimmered in the large cast-iron pot, the surface moving with convection currents that spoke of heat ready to transform raw food into something magnificent. James dipped a wooden spoon into the oil, then dropped a pinch of his seasoned flour into the pot, watching how the particles behaved. "When you drop a bit of flour in and it dances," he said, gesturing at the gentle sizzle and float of the test particles. "Not too violent, which means the oil is too hot and will burn everything. Not too calm, which means it is not hot enough and the food will absorb grease and become soggy and heavy. It has to dance active but controlled, moving but not chaotic. That is how you know it is ready. Miller nodded, committing this wisdom to memory alongside all the other techniques James had shared over the past months. The accumulated knowledge that was transforming him from someone who could follow a recipe into someone who understood the underlying principles of cooking. As 1700 hours approached, the time when meals were typically served throughout the camp, James began the frying process with the focus and care of someone performing a ritual that mattered deeply. He worked in batches, never rushing, carefully placing pieces into the hot oil with tongs, making sure not to crowd them, because crowding reduced the oil temperature and prevented proper crust formation, allowing each one enough space to develop its coating properly. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of frying chicken, a smell that transcended culture and language, speaking directly to the human appreciation for food prepared with skill and care. It was an aroma that could make anyone hungry regardless of what they had been eating earlier. That triggered memories and associations that went deeper than conscious thought, connecting to something primal about human relationship with food. The sound of sizzling fat created a rhythm that James found meditative, a steady percussion that blocked out other thoughts and centered his attention entirely on the task at hand, a counterpoint to the structured chaos of military life, where nothing ever felt fully under your control. He turned each piece with tongs, checking the color and adjusting it in the oil to ensure even cooking, monitoring the heat source and adjusting as needed, because maintaining consistent temperature was crucial to consistent results. Building a growing mountain of golden brown chicken on the drainage racks, each piece releasing excess oil while staying hot, the interior meat staying juicy, while the exterior achieved that perfect textural contrast between crunch and tenderness. The meal that evening would also include mashed potatoes, which Miller had been assigned to prepare under James's supervision, learning how to properly cook them until they were tender but not waterlogged, how to drain them completely before mashing to avoid a gluey texture, how to add just enough butter and milk to make them creamy without making them soupy. There would be green beans from industrial-sized cans, but transformed by James's touch with butter, finely diced onion that had been sweated until soft and sweet, and a careful seasoning that made people forget they were eating something that had been sitting in tin for months. And there would be biscuits that Sergeant Patterson had prepared, using a recipe he had learned from his own grandmother in the mountains of East Tennessee. Biscuits that rose high and flaky, with layers that pulled apart like pages in a book, that tasted perfect with butter, or could be used to soak up pot liquor or gravy. It was the kind of meal that reminded everyone of home, regardless of which home they came from, touching on universal human experiences of gathering around tables, of the comfort of familiar flavors, of meals that marked occasions rather than simply maintaining existence. James took pride in this aspect of his work, in the way food could create a momentary bridge between people, a shared experience that required no translation, that spoke to something deeper than nationality or language, or even the circumstances of war. At 1800 hours, precisely on schedule according to the military's relentless timekeeping, the food was ready for service. The chicken arranged on large serving trays, steam still rising from its golden surface, the potatoes fluffy in their serving containers, the green beans glistening with butter, the biscuits stacked in cloth-lined baskets that would keep them warm during transport. The usual procedure involved transferring everything to covered serving pans that would be wheeled to the prisoner mess hall on metal carts, where other personnel who specialized in guard duty and prisoner interaction would manage the distribution, maintaining the separation between support staff and those being held in custody. But on this evening, for reasons James never fully understood, there had been some kind of miscommunication or shortage of staff, perhaps related to the increased workload as the camp processed new paperwork associated with Germany's imminent collapse, perhaps simply the random chaos that characterized any large organization. Sergeant Patterson approached James with an expression that was part apology and part command, wiping his hands on his apron, and said, "You are going to need to help serve tonight. We are short 3 people due to some administrative confusion about duty rosters, and the food needs to get out there while it is hot, because serving lukewarm food to anyone, prisoner or not, defeats the entire purpose of cooking it properly in the first place. James felt a moment of deep hesitation, an uncomfortable tightening in his chest. He had never served the prisoners directly, never stood face to face with the people his cooking was feeding, never looked into the eyes of those who consumed the meals he prepared with such care. There was something profoundly unsettling about the prospect, though he could not immediately articulate precisely why the idea made him so uncomfortable. Perhaps it was the strangeness of serving people who just months ago had been part of an enemy force. Perhaps it was uncertainty about how they would react to being served by a black soldier, given what he knew about the German regime's views on race. But orders were orders, and the food was ready, so he nodded his agreement and began loading the serving pans onto the transport cart. The prisoner mess hall was a converted barracks, with long wooden tables and benches arranged in neat rows. When James wheeled the cart through the door with Miller's assistance, he found the room already filled with women waiting for their meal. The noise level dropped noticeably as they entered, conversations pausing as 247 pairs of eyes turned toward the new arrivals. James felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, but kept his expression neutral and professional as he began setting up the serving line. The prisoners filed through in orderly formation, each holding a metal tray that they extended toward the servers. James positioned himself at the chicken station, using tongs to place portions on each tray as it passed. The first few women moved through without making eye contact, accepting their food in silence. James noticed their thin wrists, the way their uniforms hung loose on frames that had clearly lost considerable weight. These were not the fierce enemy warriors that propaganda posters depicted. They were exhausted people far from home, uncertain of their fate. The fourth woman in line was different. She was perhaps 30 years old, with light brown hair pulled back in a regulation style, and when she held out her tray, she looked directly at James's face. Her eyes widened slightly, and she said something in German that he did not understand. The woman behind her responded also in German, and suddenly there was a ripple of conversation moving backward through the line. Words he could not comprehend, but that carried a tone of surprise and something else, something that might have been excitement or confusion. One of the women near the front of the line spoke English. She had been identified by the camp administration as someone who had studied languages before the conflict, and now served as an occasional translator for administrative purposes. Her name was Margareta Schneider, and she was 36 years old, a former schoolteacher from Munich who had been assigned to a communications unit in France. She stepped out of line and approached James with a hesitant expression. "Excuse me," she said, her English careful and accented but clear. "The others are asking, did you prepare this food?" James nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I cooked the chicken." Margaret turned and translated this to the women nearby, and the ripple of conversation grew louder. James glanced at Miller, who looked equally confused by this reaction. Margaret turned back to James. "They are surprised," she said. "This is—" She paused, searching for words. "This is like food from home. The chicken, the way it is prepared. It reminds them of Sunday meals with their families. They did not expect this. They expected different food, military food without care." James was not sure how to respond to this. He had simply cooked the meal the way he knew how, using techniques passed down through his family. But apparently something in that preparation had resonated across the cultural divide. "It is just fried chicken," he said finally. "My grandmother's way of making it." Margaret translated this, and several women smiled for the first time since James had entered the hall. One of them, a young woman who looked barely 20, said something that made others laugh softly. Margaret translated, "She says her mother made chicken like this every Sunday after church. She says she has not thought about those days in a very long time." As the line continued moving, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. The silence gave way to quiet conversations, and several women made eye contact with James as they received their portions, nodding in what appeared to be gratitude or perhaps recognition of shared humanity. One older woman, her face creased with lines that spoke of hardship, stopped in front of him and said in halting English, "Thank you. It is good. Very good." James felt something constrict in his chest, an unexpected emotion that he had to push down to maintain his professional composure. When all the prisoners had been served, James and Miller began the cleanup process, while the women ate their meal. James could hear the sounds of eating, the scrape of forks on metal trays, and occasional murmurs of conversation. He tried to focus on his work, loading empty pans back onto the cart, but he could not help glancing over at the tables where the prisoners sat. Many of them were eating slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each bite. Several had tears running down their faces, though they made no sound of crying. Private Miller whispered to James, "I have never seen anything like this. It is just chicken. Why are they reacting this way?" James shook his head slowly. "It is not just chicken," he said quietly. "It is a taste of something they lost, a reminder that they are still human, still connected to the lives they had before all this. Food does that sometimes. It reaches past everything else straight to memory and feeling." As they prepared to leave, Margaret approached them again. She seemed to be acting as a spokesperson for the group. On behalf of the others, she said, "I want to thank you properly. You have given us a gift today, perhaps without meaning to. For months we have been eating food that keeps us alive but does not feed our spirits. Tonight you fed both. We will not forget this kindness." James felt uncomfortable with the praise, not because it was undeserved, but because it highlighted the strange complexities of his situation. He was a black man in a segregated army, cooking for women who had served a regime that considered his race inferior, and somehow, in this bizarre circumstance, he had created a moment of human connection that transcended all those layers of hatred and division. It was disorienting and profound in equal measure. After that evening, James's role shifted subtly within the camp. Word spread among the administrative staff about the reaction to his cooking, and he found himself assigned to prepare meals for the female prisoners more frequently. Sergeant Patterson, who managed the kitchen rotation, seemed to understand that something important had happened, even if he could not fully articulate it. The camp commander, Colonel Harrison, who James had never met directly, apparently took notice as well, because he sent down orders that James should be given access to better ingredients when available and more flexibility in his menu planning. Over the following weeks, James continued to cook meals that drew on his family traditions, adapting them to military scale and available supplies. He made cornbread with a touch of honey when sugar rations allowed. He prepared greens with smoked ham hocks when the supply depot provided them. He made biscuits from scratch instead of using the pre-mixed dough that was standard issue. Each meal seemed to elicit similar reactions from the prisoners, expressions of surprise and sometimes emotion, at finding comfort in unexpected places. Margaret became a regular presence at mealtimes, often serving as an informal bridge between James and the other prisoners. She told him stories about their backgrounds, their journeys to this place, their fears and hopes for what would come next. He learned that many of them had not wanted to serve in the military, but had been conscripted or pressured into service through various means. He learned that some had families they had not heard from in months, unsure if their homes still stood, or if their loved ones had survived the chaos of the conflict's final stages. He learned that they had been taught to expect torture or execution if captured, and that the reality of American imprisonment, with its relative humanity and order, had shaken their understanding of everything they had been told. One evening in early May, as the news of Germany's surrender spread through the camp, James prepared a special meal to mark the occasion. He made fried chicken again, along with potato salad, coleslaw, and an improvised dessert using canned peaches and leftover biscuit dough to create something resembling cobbler. When he brought the food to the mess hall, he found the atmosphere subdued. The prisoners knew the conflict had ended, which meant their homeland had been defeated, but it also meant the killing had stopped. The emotions in the room were complicated. Grief and relief mixed together in ways that defied simple categorization. As James served the meal, one of the younger women, a girl named Elizabeth, who Margaret said was only 19, broke down crying when she saw the food. She said something in German between sobs, and Margaret translated quietly. She says this meal is too kind for people like us. She says we do not deserve such treatment after everything our country did. James felt his throat tighten. He set down his tongs and looked directly at Elizabeth, waiting until she met his eyes. "Tell her something for me," he said to Margaret. "Tell her that every person deserves to be fed with dignity, no matter what uniform they wore or what flag they served. Tell her that I learned from my grandmother that cooking for someone is an act of recognition, seeing them as human and worth the care it takes to prepare a good meal. Tell her that holding on to that belief is how we find our way back from darkness." Margaret translated, speaking softly, and Elizabeth nodded through her tears. Other women nearby had heard the exchange, and several reached out to touch Elizabeth's shoulder or arm, offering quiet comfort. James returned to serving, but he noticed that many of the prisoners looked at him differently after that moment, with something that went beyond gratitude into territory that was more complex and profound. In the weeks that followed Germany's surrender, the camp began processing prisoners for eventual repatriation, though the logistics of returning thousands of people to a devastated homeland were complicated and slow. James continued his duties, maintaining the quality of his cooking, even as uncertainty about the future hung over everyone. He noticed that several of the prisoners had begun trying to communicate with him directly, learning basic English phrases so they could express their appreciation without needing Margaret's translation. "Good meal," they would say, or "Thank you, cook," and James would nod in acknowledgement, maintaining the professional distance that military protocols required, while recognizing the human connection that had somehow formed in this unlikely space. One afternoon in June, James was called to the camp commander's office, a summons that filled him with immediate anxiety. Black soldiers being called to see commanding officers rarely resulted in positive outcomes in his experience. He walked across the compound with his stomach tight, rehearsing possible explanations for whatever infraction he might have unknowingly committed. When he entered the office, Colonel Harrison was seated behind his desk, and standing beside him was Margaret, looking nervous but composed. "Corporal Washington," the colonel said, gesturing for James to sit, "I have received an unusual request that I wanted to discuss with you. Miss Schneider here has asked if it might be possible for some of the prisoners to learn cooking techniques from you. She says several of them want to understand how to prepare the meals you have been serving, so they can recreate them when they return home. She has assured me this would be purely educational and properly supervised." James looked at Margaret in surprise. She met his gaze steadily. "It would mean a great deal to many of us," she said. "You have given us something precious during a very dark time. We would like to carry that knowledge forward, to share it with our families when we are reunited with them. It is a way of taking something good from this experience." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair. "I will be honest, Corporal. This is outside any normal protocol. But these are unusual circumstances, and I have discretion in how I manage this facility. If you are willing to do this, I will authorize supervised sessions in the kitchen where you can demonstrate your techniques to small groups. It would be voluntary for everyone involved, and there would always be guards present to maintain security. What do you think?" James sat quietly for a moment, processing this unexpected development. The idea of teaching enemy prisoners how to cook soul food from Alabama was so strange that it almost made him laugh. But he recognized the genuine intent behind the request. These women wanted to learn not just techniques, but a philosophy of care and dignity in preparing food. They wanted to carry forward something that had touched them during their imprisonment. How could he refuse that? "I will do it," he said finally. "If the colonel approves, I will be glad to teach anyone who wants to learn." The cooking sessions began the following week. James was assigned a small group of 6 prisoners for the first session, with Margaret serving as translator, and 2 guards stationed at the door. He had prepared ingredients for fried chicken, thinking it made sense to start with the dish that had sparked everything. The women watched intently as he demonstrated the buttermilk soak, the seasoned flour dredge, the proper oil temperature, the careful placement of pieces to avoid crowding. He explained his grandmother's philosophy of cooking, how she had taught him that food was more than sustenance, it was communication, care, and culture all combined. The women asked questions through Margareta about specific techniques, about ingredient substitutions they might need to make in Germany where resources were scarce, about how to judge doneness without a thermometer. James answered each question patiently, demonstrating multiple times when needed, letting them try the techniques themselves under his supervision. He noticed their concentration, the way they committed each detail to memory, as if documenting something precious. One woman, whose name was Helga, and who had worked in a bakery before the conflict, had particularly skilled hands and picked up the techniques quickly. She helped translate some of the more complex instructions, finding ways to explain textures and timing that went beyond simple language. As the sessions continued over subsequent weeks, James taught them other dishes from his repertoire. He showed them how to make proper cornbread, crispy on the outside and tender within. He demonstrated the technique for greens, the long, slow cooking that transformed tough leaves into something silky and flavorful. He taught them biscuit making, the importance of cold butter and a light hand. Each session brought moments of laughter and concentration, temporary spaces where the boundaries between guard and prisoner, victor and defeated, black and white, all seemed to dissolve in the shared focus on creating something good. One evening, after a particularly successful session, where the group had prepared an entire meal together, Margaret lingered as the others were escorted back to their barracks. She seemed to want to say something, but was struggling to find the words. Finally, she spoke, looking directly at James with an expression that combined shame and earnestness. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "Before I was taken into custody, before I came here, I believed terrible things. I was taught that people of your race were inferior, incapable of culture or refinement. I am ashamed to admit I accepted these teachings without question, but you have shown me how deeply wrong that was. Your cooking, your patience in teaching us, your dignity and how you carry yourself, all of it has confronted me with my own prejudice. I cannot undo what I believed or the system I was part of, but I want you to know that you have changed me. When I return home, I will carry that change forward. I will teach my students, if I am able to teach again, that hatred is a lie and that humanity exists in all people." James felt a complex swirl of emotions at this confession. Part of him wanted to be angry at the casual admission of such prejudice, at the way she spoke of his humanity, as if it had needed proving. But another part recognized the courage it took to acknowledge such a transformation, to admit being fundamentally wrong about something so central. He thought about his grandmother, who had always told him that the best revenge against hatred was to live well and treat others with more dignity than you received. Maybe this was what she had meant. "I appreciate you telling me that," he said finally. "And I hope you do teach those lessons when you go home. We have all been taught lies of one kind or another. The work is in recognizing them and choosing different paths forward." By August of 1945, as the camp prepared for the eventual repatriation of prisoners, James had taught cooking sessions to over 50 women. He had documented his grandmother's recipes for the first time, writing them out with Margaret's help so they could be shared among the prisoners. It felt strange to put these family secrets on paper, but his grandmother had always said that recipes were meant to be shared, that food brought people together, and he thought she would have approved of this particular sharing. The day came in September, when the first group of prisoners was scheduled to leave Fort Oglethorpe for transport to ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic. James was in the kitchen preparing a regular meal service when Margaret appeared at the door accompanied by a guard. She was part of the group leaving that afternoon, and she had asked permission to say goodbye. James wiped his hands on his apron and stepped outside with her, away from the kitchen noise. "I wanted to give you this before I left," Margaret said, holding out a folded piece of paper. "Several of us worked together to write it. It is in German, but I will translate. It is a letter of gratitude, signed by 130 women who were imprisoned here. It thanks you for treating us with humanity and dignity when you had no obligation to do so. It promises that we will remember what you taught us, both in cooking and in how to see beyond the lies we were told. Some of us have addresses where we hope to be reunited with family. If you ever wish to write, we would be honored to respond." James took the letter, feeling the weight of what it represented. He had never expected anything like this when he first fried chicken on that April evening so many months ago. He had just been doing his job, cooking the way his grandmother had taught him, but somehow that simple act had created ripples that reached farther than he could have imagined. "You take care of yourself over there," he said to Margaret. "It is going to be hard, rebuilding. But if you hold on to what is good and true, you will find your way." Margaret nodded, tears visible in her eyes. "You have given us a gift that we will carry forever," she said. "In the darkness of what our country became, you showed us light. You reminded us that humanity persists even in the strangest places. We will not forget. After she left, James returned to his kitchen duties, but he kept the letter in his pocket, occasionally touching it as he worked. That evening, as he prepared the dinner service, Private Miller noticed his distracted mood. "You all right, Corporal?" Miller asked. James nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "just thinking about how strange life can be. A few months ago I was cooking for people I was supposed to consider enemies. Now I am watching them leave and feeling something like sadness that they are going. Makes you wonder what other lies we tell ourselves about who deserves our kindness." Miller considered this for a moment. "My dad used to say that the hardest thing about war is that it forces you to hate people you have never met. But maybe the flip side is that peace gives you a chance to know people you were supposed to hate. Sounds like that is what happened here." James smiled at the young soldier's insight. "Yeah," he said, "I think that is exactly what happened." In the months that followed the war's conclusion, James continued his service in the Quartermaster Corps, eventually being reassigned to other facilities and eventually mustering out in 1946. He returned to Birmingham with his honorable discharge papers and the letter from the German prisoners, which he kept in a box with his other important documents. He opened a small restaurant using skills he had refined during his military service, serving food that combined his grandmother's traditional recipes with techniques he had developed feeding thousands of people. Over the years, he occasionally received letters from Germany, from women who had been imprisoned at Fort Oglethorpe and who had kept their promises to remember. They wrote about their lives rebuilding, about teaching their children and grandchildren the recipes he had shared, about how a simple act of kindness from a cook in Georgia had helped them find their way back to humanity after the darkness of the conflict. Some sent photographs of their families gathered around tables laden with fried chicken made according to his grandmother's method, meals prepared with care and gratitude. James always wrote back, short letters that maintained the connection without dwelling too heavily on the past. He told them about his restaurant, about his growing family, about the ways Birmingham was slowly, painfully, beginning to change its attitudes about race. He told them that his grandmother had passed away in 1948, but that she had been proud to hear that her recipes had traveled so far and brought comfort to people she would never meet. He told them that he had learned from them as much as they had learned from him, that they had taught him something important about the persistence of humanity, even in systems designed to destroy it. One letter that arrived in 1953 came from Margaret, who had resumed teaching in Munich and had married a fellow teacher who shared her commitment to building a different kind of Germany. She wrote about teaching her students English and cooking, combining the two subjects to pass along both skills and values. She wrote about how she told them the story of a black cook in America who had treated German prisoners with more dignity than they had any right to expect, and how that example had taught her that prejudice was a choice that could be unmade through contact with truth. She wrote that she had named her daughter Anna Elizabeth, and that she hoped to raise her to see all people as worthy of respect, regardless of race or nationality or any other category people use to divide themselves from one another. James kept that letter with special care, reading it sometimes when he needed to remember that individual actions mattered, that small kindnesses could ripple outward in ways that transcended the moment. He thought about that April evening in 1945, about the surprise on the faces of women who had expected cruelty and found care instead. He thought about his grandmother's teaching that food was communication and connection, and how right she had been. He thought about the strangeness of finding common ground with people who were supposed to be enemies, and what that revealed about the arbitrary nature of those categories. When James passed away in 1978, his obituary in the Birmingham newspaper mentioned his military service and his successful restaurant, but did not tell the story of Fort Oglethorpe. That story was known only to his family and to the scattered women across Germany who still remembered a kindness that had changed them. His daughter kept the letters in a box, along with his discharge papers and the photographs of him in uniform, documents of a life lived with quiet dignity in circumstances that often denied dignity to people who looked like him. Years later, when historians began collecting oral histories from people who had lived through the conflict from all sides, some of those German women told the story of the black cook who had fed them fried chicken and taught them about humanity. The accounts were remarkably consistent across different interviews, describing the same details, the same emotional impact, the same transformation of understanding. Some historians were skeptical, thinking perhaps the story had been embellished over decades of retelling, but the letters provided documentary evidence, and photographs from the period showed James Washington at Fort Oglethorpe, confirming his presence and role. The story became a small footnote in the larger history of the conflict, one of thousands of individual moments that complicated the simple narratives of good and evil, ally and enemy, victor and vanquished. It illustrated how even in systems designed to dehumanize, individual choices could create spaces of recognition and respect. It demonstrated that prejudice was not inevitable, but learned, and therefore could be unlearned through authentic encounter with the humanity of others. It showed that something as simple as cooking food with care could become an act of resistance against hatred, a small bridge across divides that politics and war had created. The recipes that James had shared continued to be passed down through German families who had learned them at Fort Oglethorpe, adapted over generations to local tastes and available ingredients, but retaining the core techniques and the philosophy of care that had informed them. In Bavaria, a grandmother made fried chicken for Sunday dinner using the buttermilk soak method, telling her grandchildren about an American cook who had taught her mother this preparation during the difficult years after the war. In Hamburg, a teacher incorporated fried chicken into a lesson about cultural exchange and the complexity of history, explaining how food could carry meanings beyond nutrition. In Berlin, a family restaurant served Southern-style fried chicken on its menu, with a small note explaining its origins in an unlikely connection formed in Georgia decades earlier. James Washington could not have known, standing in that kitchen in 1945, what the long-term impact of his cooking would be. He had simply done his job the way his grandmother had taught him, with care and attention and the belief that feeding someone was an act of recognition. But that simple act, repeated across months of service, had created something larger than he could have anticipated. It had helped a group of traumatized women find their way back to humanity. It had challenged deeply embedded prejudices on both sides. It had demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, individual choices could create light. The story of James Washington and the prisoners of Fort Oglethorpe is not one that changed the outcome of the conflict or altered the grand sweep of history. But it is a story about the smaller, more intimate ways that history is made, through individual encounters and unexpected connections that reveal the fundamental humanity underlying all the divisions people create. It is a story about food as more than sustenance, about cooking as more than technique, about the ways that care and dignity can persist even in spaces designed to deny them. It is a reminder that every person contains the capacity for change, and that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not through grand gestures, but through simple acts repeated with consistency and genuine intent. In the end, what James Washington offered those women was not just fried chicken, but a taste of something they thought they had lost forever, a reminder that they were still connected to life and memory and the possibility of goodness. And what they offered him in return was confirmation that his grandmother had been right all along, that treating people with dignity regardless of circumstances was not naive optimism but profound wisdom, that small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways that exceeded any individual's ability to predict or control. Both sides were transformed by the encounter. Both carried something forward that shaped how they understood themselves and others for the rest of their lives. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.